The year is 1999. The millennium bug is hitting. The world is about to change in a massive way. In technology, the PS2 is about to release. Computers are becoming more accessible than ever, and gaming has risen up from something to do on the weekend in an arcade to a common home pastime. But one series was rising up in a big way. One studio was taking PC gaming to the next level, almost single-handedly pushing it into the next generation of AI graphics and gameplay. Now, the series had released a game previously to, let's not forget, great success, but it was about to unleash a game that would take the world by storm and become the keystone to all that is real-time strategy. That game was Age of Empires 2. But to take a look at the effect Age of Empires 2 had on the gaming landscape, it's important to get an idea of the place that PC gaming was in at the time, with games like Half-Life 2, Fallout 4, StarCraft and the Elder Scrolls ruling the market. There was not all that much in terms of history. You see, the 90s was a time of change, a time with people thinking, what's next? Everyone was looking to the future. The releasing of a prequel series of the biggest trilogy of all time in Star Wars had people reaching further into space with robots and lasers and everything techno. And whilst games like StarCraft had the RTS genre pinned down, they were still, like much else at the time, focused on the future and the futuristic elements. Everything in the late 90s was looking and predicting forward, trying to get their ideas for games from what might come later in time, rather than looking back at the wealth of periods, ideas and information from the past. But Ensemble Studios didn't think this way. They were about the history, what had already been, and reliving it in the modern day. And this is where they found their niche for their version of the popular RTS. In the past. Ensemble Studios released Age of Empires 1 back in 1997. The game was set in the ancient civilizations and let players advance through 4 ages. The Stone, Tool, Bronze and Iron Ages, with each age gaining new and improved units and different technologies to increase strength as the game goes on. The game itself was very well received, especially for a first in the series. With a backing of Microsoft, it reached 55 countries in its first 4 months, making it one of the best-selling PC strategy games of its time. Now, the game delivered well and people loved it, but they weren't done yet. On September 30th, 1999, Age of Empires 2 was released. It took what they did in the first and expanded upon it massively, moving into a medieval setting and perhaps creating one of the most diverse and unique sets of civilizations and units of any game, especially back at that time. For example, at the time of AoE 1, it was often criticised of how easy the AI was to be, but this was because most strategy games at the time had cheating AI. They would give the computer the ability to gain resources, create units and upgrades in ways or time spaces that a normal player just physically could not. But Ensemble Studios refused to go this way. Yes, whilst they were criticised that their AI was too easy, they wanted it to play legit. So instead, Age of Empires 2, they created a completely new AI that was leagues above anything else in the series at the time, and it was actually a tough opponent without the need for cheating. And was it received well. Within 3 months after its release, it had sold 2 million copies, as opposed to Age of Empires 1's 650,000 copies in the first 4 months. So yeah, it did pretty well. Reviews itself gave it a universal acclaim, and it was on the whole seen as one of the best strategy games at the time, and it still is. So why has it kept up this long? Why do people still play it? You see, whilst Age of Empires 2 had the obvious things making it special, special units, a vast array of factions all having different buffs and researches that can be done, complete map editing and a long linear campaign, that wasn't what made it so special. It was the smaller details that put it above all the other RTS titles at the time, and even now, 21 years later in the future. Things like the small snippets of the native language when you click on a unit. The way the game is based on building infrastructure to help the economy, to then help the army, and is all self-sufficient. There's no capturing command posts or buildings to get more resources or so on. If you knew what you were doing, all the resources in the game were infinite. Interaction with fellow players through trading and faction buffs that affects allies as well as just you. And of course, the flow of land and sea combat, the way you can move seamlessly between them and use terrain to your advantage or disadvantage, with trees blocking paths, oceans creating choke points, or cliffs diverting enemies into well-placed put towers that you had meticulously planned for a while. I mean, many games have tried to replicate this in things like Dawn of War, and whilst it had some fantastic success, it was never quite the same. Given the time it was released in, Age of Empires 2 looks good as well. I mean, it doesn't exactly hold much of a candle to the definitive editions when compared to, as we'll get later on, but the HD edition, when it was actually released, didn't change all that much. And even though its name does say HD edition, the original game looked absolutely fine. But the graphics weren't everything. Somehow the community for Age of Empires is not only stronger than ever, but some could say it's still growing. Since its release, the game has had an extremely loyal fanbase, a community that is rarely found these days, and even back then, few games have managed to keep a consistent player base after decades of the game actually being out. Games like StarCraft, World of Warcraft, and, well, Mario Kart have actually managed to do this, but it is so rare for people to still join the community, even now, so long after the initial release. But Age of Empires has done that. They've managed to stay up there. And I think this is thanks to the perfect gameplay mechanics, the feel of starting out, sending villagers to gather meat from the livestock nearby, luring boars, getting wood and resources and building up your economy, then building your first barracks and maybe a few clubmen and spears, in case of the inevitable rush or charge that players love to spring on newbies, then growing and growing until you're just an unstoppable force of elite units and monks. Now, I just want to quickly jump into this segment, because there was a video that I watched the other day by 2Clicks Philip, who makes some videos on, well, pretty much whatever he wants, but he spoke of the legendary gameplay and the lifespan that Age of Empires 2 has had, and it was kind of the first video on the game that I actually felt like related to me. You see, I have made videos talking about AoE in the past, and I'm sure the same is going to happen on the comments in this video, but people will always mention how, oh, you didn't put a farm in the exact right place, or the boar luring was sloppy, or my Castle Age rush wasn't quite right, but who cares? Age of Empires 2 was the first game I ever played, sitting at my family computer when I was 3 or 4, watching my dad play it, and all this time, I'm about to turn 21, I have never played an online game. My experience of Age of Empires 2, as I'm sure is many people's, was just setting up a normal match against the AI on various difficulty levels and testing to see how far I could get against each one. Changing factions each game and the difficulty and the number of opponents. Alongside that, doing the same with a few friends in co-op matches and destroying any deaf computer-controlled armies that I could find, and that's what I love. And that's what I always want to do in the game. Anyway, I just thought I'd mention it and put it in there, as I feel like this elitist community that is currently in the Age of Empires games have perhaps scared away many casual players, and perhaps it will help to hear someone else's experience of that gameplay. But it's actually a big part of how the game has lasted. Even if we do jump over to the competitive side, the esports scene is massive. Okay, so it's not anywhere near the viewer base or the prize pools that games like CSGO or Dota, but there is a seriously dedicated set of players, casters and audience members that keep it going. And whilst I have just had a ramble about how the game needs to be a bit more accepting to casual players, I do love to poke my nose in every now and then to a competitive stream and watch as players do tactics and moves that I couldn't have ever even dreamt up of. It truly is a completely different playstyle and a way of approaching, admittedly, at its base core, is such a simple game. Years on, members from the original team at Ensemble Studios under the name of Hidden Pathway Entertainment wanted to develop a more updated version of the game, to bring it back in a big way to a new audience. And I think this is where the main revival for Age of Empires 2 came. In 2013, AoE 2 HD Edition was released on Steam, and everyone was like, "Wow, it's just Age of Empires 2 again." Whilst it didn't really matter too much because of how beloved the base game was, HD Edition was somewhat criticised by how little was actually changed from the original. Yeah, the textures were a bit better, and the optimization for newer PCs was much greater, the multiplayer options were really improved, and Steam Workshop integration is always well received. But it didn't do all that much in terms of additions to the game. But after all, it is only called HD Edition. The big changes would come later, in the definitive version. After the backlash from fans about the Age of Empires 1 Definitive Edition being exclusively released on Windows Store, they launched in a big way with Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition onto Steam from the get-go. And it worked out great for them. The game was a massive overhaul, and it still amazes me to this day what they can actually manage to do by implementing new 4K textures and graphics. The new version added in 4 new factions and of course some new campaign missions, and it really was a definitive edition. The new releases of Age of Empires only furthered the growth of the community around the franchise as a whole. With Age of Empires 3 Definitive now released, they are really on their way back up. Fans now have Age of Mythology Definitive and Age of Empires 4 coming in the future, so there is much excitement and buzz around the franchise, making it perhaps bigger than it has ever been. I think what the Age of Empires games have done as a whole is something absolutely incredible. Keeping a community so large and dedicated over 23 years after its first release is pretty much unheard of, and I think the future is only brighter for what we can expect. There is quite rightly a lot of skepticism around AoE 4, and I do think if they try and overstep their mark, there could be a big wave coming through the community of criticism, because let's be honest, the devs have done a fantastic job keeping people happy and fans wanting more, but at the moment all they've done is re-release old games that they already knew were going to be well received. The real test is going to be coming soon, when they add a new addition to the franchise and see how it is received by such an old school fan base. Overall, I think Age of Empires 2 has to be, for me and I think most people, the biggest mark in the franchise. It's where people really fell in love and brought these strategy games to the mainstream, and somehow it's continued to do that. I can't wait for the future with these guys, and I think AoE 2 has solidified itself as one of the best games of all time, even 21 years later.